spiritual realm that exists alongside the world as we know it.
Right, and the biblical authors are no exception.
Yeah, for them, the spiritual realm is a different kind of realm than. For most of human history, people have believed in some kind of spiritual realm that exists alongside the world as we know it.
Right, and the biblical authors are no exception.
Yeah, for them, the spiritual realm is a different kind of realm than ours. And to highlight that difference, the Bible refers to God's space as the sky or the heavens.
Because the sky is really different from the land. It's above and beyond. And up there are shiny bodies that move around. I think of these as flaming gas balls.
But when the biblical authors looked up, the stars gave them a way to talk and think about spiritual beings. In the Bible, they're called the sons of God, or the rulers and authorities, or even sometimes the divine council.
So that sounds really important. What does the divine council do?
Well, they're introduced in Genesis chapter 1, where they're called the host of heaven, that is, the sun, moon, and stars. And there, they're also called signs, meaning that their power and status symbolizes and points to God's power and status.
Yeah, so in Genesis 1, God appoints them to rule over the day and night.
Exactly. And then later in the Bible, we're told that they were celebrating God's power and creativity when he created the world.
Like the cheering section of a game.
Yeah, right. There are also stories in the Bible where God invites the divine council to participate in making a decision. Like when they help decide how to bring down the corrupt Israelite king Ahab. Or in the book of Job, where they debate God's policy of rewarding people who do good.
So they're like God's staff team. But why does God need a team? If he's powerful enough to create the whole universe, he could surely rule it without any help.
Well, he doesn't need them. But apparently, the God of the Bible wants to share authority with others.
Oh, right. God shares his rule with human partners on Earth. And so, in the same way, there's a parallel story of God sharing his authority to rule with spiritual partners.
Yes, that is, until it all falls apart in a twin rebellion. So you have humans who want to rule on Earth on their own terms. So they start building their own nation using their own definitions of good and evil.
Yeah, the famous story of the building of Babylon.
But check this out. When biblical authors like Moses or Isaiah looked back at the origins of Babylon, they saw more than just a human rebellion, but also a spiritual rebellion.
What was this spiritual rebellion?
Well, there were members of the divine council who, like the humans, didn't want to represent God's authority anymore. They wanted to be God, and they rebelled. And so these created beings deceived humans into worshiping them instead of the Creator. And so Babylon becomes the biblical image for the combined human and spiritual rebellion.
And so God scatters the people from Babylon into different nations.
And in the book of Deuteronomy, Moses says, this is when God also scattered the rebels of the divine council with them.
So the nations are handed over to spiritual rulers.
Yes, and this is why when the biblical prophets look out at the violent empires of their day, they see two dimensions to all the chaos and injustice. Human rebels who are being corrupted by the worship of spiritual rebels, the idol gods of money, sex, and military power.
Yeah, when humans give their allegiance to these powers, it leads to a world like ours.
Right, and the best example of this is the story of the Exodus, where we're told that the Egyptian genocide of the Israelites was inspired by Pharaoh and by the gods of Egypt.
That's really intense.
But it's not the end of the story. When God rescued the Israelites from Egypt and its gods, he invited them to become his covenant partners and learn a different way of ruling the world.
And they agree to it, but in the end they don't honor the partnership. They give their allegiance to other gods.
And so this leads to their exile in Babylon, where they become slaves once again to a foreign nation and their spiritual rulers, awaiting a new exodus into freedom. And this is where the story of Jesus picks up. He said he was here to rescue the world and take it back from the rebels.
Which rebels? The human ones or the spiritual ones?
Exactly. For Jesus, it was all connected. When he marched into Jerusalem for Passover, he was announcing the ultimate exodus. He was there to confront and overcome all rebel powers and authorities, and he did it by giving up his life.
So this is what the Apostle Paul meant when he said that Jesus disarmed the powers and authorities, triumphing over them by the cross.
Yes, Jesus condemned our evil by allowing the rebels to unleash all their hate and evil on him. But then he overcame it with the power of his love and resurrection life. And then Jesus told his followers that all authority in heaven and earth now belongs to him.
Now, the ultimate human and divine partner. This is really good news.
Yeah, And it's why the apostles started inviting everyone to give their allegiance to the risen Jesus, to discover freedom and a new way to be human.
Now, while Jesus gained a decisive victory over the rebel powers, he didn't destroy them. They're still around, causing problems.
Yes, and in fact, they are the problem. The apostles said that humanity's real enemy is never another human. Rather, it's the spiritual powers that animate our cultural idols that inspire hatred, division, and violence.
So when I see people hurting other people, behind it is the divine council gone rogue. How do you deal with this kind of enemy?
Well, the Apostle Paul said we can resist by putting on the character traits of Jesus like armor, faithfulness, justice, and peace. And he said that our only weapon is the Word of God. That is, the biblical story of good news that Jesus has overcome all rebels with the divine power of his life and love.
Are among the most fascinating objects in our universe, and also the most mysterious. The force of gravity is so strong, not even light, the fastest known entity in our universe, can escape. The boundary of a black hole is called the event horizon, a point of no return, beyond which we truly cannot see. When something crosses the event horizon, it collapses into the black hole's singularity, an infinitely small, infinitely dense point where space, time, and the laws of physics no longer apply. Scientists have theorized several different types of black holes, with stellar and supermassive black holes being the most common. Stellar black holes form when massive stars die and collapse. They're roughly 10 to 20 times the mass of our sun and scattered throughout the universe. There could be millions of these stellar black holes in the Milky Way alone. Supermassive black holes are giants by comparison, measuring millions, even billions of times more massive than our sun. Scientists can only guess how they form, but we do know they exist at the center of just about every large galaxy, including our own. Sagittarius A, the supermassive black hole at the center of the Milky Way, has a mass of roughly 4 million suns and has a diameter about the distance between the Earth and our sun. Because black holes are invisible, the only way for scientists to detect and study them is to observe their effect on nearby matter. This includes accretion disks, a disk of particles that form when gases and dust fall toward a black hole, and quasars, jets of particles that blast out of supermassive black holes. Black holes remained largely unknown until the 20th century. In 1916, using Einstein's general theory of relativity, a German physicist named Karl Schwarzschild calculated that any mass could become a black hole if it were compressed tightly enough. But it wasn't until 1971 when theory became reality. Astronomers studying the constellation Cygnus discovered the first black hole. An untold number of black holes are scattered throughout the universe, constantly warping space and time, altering entire galaxies, and endlessly inspiring both scientists and our collective imagination.
Biographers will tell you that time, the word, T-I, day, without talking about time all the time. When we actually talk about it, if you say, meet me at 7 p.m., no one panics. No one says like, oh my God, what are you talking about with these esoteric concepts about 7 p.m.? You know, we all know what to do operationally. Time, in some sense, is just a label on different events in the universe. The universe happens over and over again at different things we call moments, and time helps us tell the difference between one moment and another. So what time is, I don't think is the problem. The issue, the real puzzles, come about when we talk about the properties that time has. We have a past, we have a present, we have a future. How are they different? Are we moving through it? We have memories of the past, but we have no memories of the future. Why is that? Where does that asymmetry come from? Why are we all born young? Why do we all inevitably age? Why do we think that we can affect the future but not the past? Could we possibly travel back into it? Anyway, there's a lot of questions about the nature of time that are really confusing, and many of them we don't know the answer to. But what time is, I don't think it's one of them. one of the most noticeable features of time is that it has a direction, right? That there's a difference between the past and future. Sometimes we think about this as just an intrinsic feature of reality, like the past already happened, it's in the books, the future is up for grabs, it hasn't happened yet, and the present is where we live. But then along comes physics, and what people notice about our best theories of physics is that those theories do not distinguish between the past and the future. But in our everyday lives, nothing is more obvious. It really requires a bit of mental discipline to say, well, time could exist without an arrow. And one way of thinking about that is, there is no intrinsic arrow of space, but there's still space, okay? We live in a three-dimensional world, up, down, left, right, forward, backward. At the level of the fundamental laws of physics, there's no special direction in space. And how you perceive that is, imagine you're an astronaut, you're flying around in your little spacesuit, there wouldn't be any difference between any direction you could look. There's no experiment you could do in physics that would point out a direction in the universe, but space still exists. Likewise, time would still exist even if there wasn't an arrow. But here on Earth, we do have an arrow of space. If I pick up a coffee cup and let it go, it will always fall down. There's clearly a distinction between up and down. No one is tempted to think that's a fundamental feature of the universe. It's not because downness is embedded in the laws of physics. It's because we live in the vicinity of an influential object, the Earth. The arrow of time is exactly the same way. We, in our everyday lives, perceive an arrow of time because we live in the aftermath of an influential event, the Big Bang. And that gets us into a realm of the concept of entropy. Entropy is how messy, how disorganized, how random a system is. When things are nice and neat and tidy, they are low entropy. When they're all messy and all over the place, they are high entropy. And there's a natural tendency of things in the universe to go from low entropy to high entropy. This is called the second law of thermodynamics. The real question is, why was the world ever low entropy to begin with? Why was the world lower entropy yesterday than it is today? The explanation is not completely satisfying, to be honest. The explanation is the following: because it was even lower entropy the day before yesterday. And why was the universe even lower entropy the day before yesterday? Because it was even lower entropy the day before that. And this chain of reasoning goes back 14 billion years to the Big Bang, to the origin of our observable universe in a hot, dense state, a very low entropy state, and the universe has been increasing in entropy ever since. And this is called the past hypothesis by philosophers. David Albert, who's a philosopher of physics, gave it this name. So now we say, if you know that the world is made of atoms, and you know what entropy is in terms of rearranging all those atoms, and you know the past hypothesis, that the entropy of the universe started really low, then you can explain everything that happened after that. There's a way of talking about human life and entropy which I think is misguided, which is that we should think about life, literally living, being a biological organism, taking in food and everything, as a fight against increasing entropy. I think that's wrong. I think that we owe life to the fact that entropy is increasing, because what would it mean if entropy were not increasing? It would mean that nothing is happening, nothing interesting is taking place. Without entropy increasing, there's no memory of the past. Without entropy increasing, there's no causal effect that we have on the future. You would just be in what we call thermal equilibrium. Everything would be the same everywhere. It would be the maximally boring universe. But what we do have as a scientific question is, why do complicated, complex structures come into existence at all? It's clear that they need increasing entropy to exist, because if entropy were already maxed out, there would be no complexity. But that doesn't mean they have to come into existence. Think about a famous example where the perfume is all in a little bottle, it's in a big room, you open it, and it all floats through the room. The entropy of the perfume increases. But if you think about it, when the perfume is all in the bottle, it's very simple. Once it's all spread through the room, it's also very simple. It went from low entropy to high entropy, but it went from simple to simple. It's the journey from the simple low entropy starting point to the simple high entropy ending point that there's a large space of possibilities where things can be intricate. There's more perfume here over there. There can be swirls caused by the motion of the wind in the room and so forth. This is just like that. Our universe started out simple and low entropy. In the future, the stars will die, the black holes will evaporate, it'll be dark, empty, and again simple, but high entropy. It's in between that things like us, complicated, intricate systems that feed off of the increasing entropy of the universe, can and do come into existence. We don't know the whole story there. I think this is a very fun, active, scientific research area. Why did complex structures like living beings come into existence in exactly the way we did? What is the role of information? What is the down-to-earth chemistry that is going on here? What is the geology that is going on here? Could it happen on other planets? Very interesting questions. But one thing I do know is that if entropy weren't increasing along the way, none of it would have come to pass.
About the universe that blows your mind the most?
There are a lot of things about the universe that I find it almost impossible to imagine. One, just the size and scale of it. I mean, in the piece of the universe we can see, there are something like 2 trillion galaxies. We haven't counted them all, but that's an estimate based on surveys of the local universe. 2 trillion, 2,000 billion galaxies. And each galaxy is, let's say, around the size of the Milky Way. Some are bigger, some are smaller, but the Milky Way has 400 billion stars in it. It takes light over 100,000 years to cross a galaxy, and there are 2 trillion of them in a piece of the universe we can see. And we're very sure that that piece that we can see is a small bit of what may be an infinite universe beyond. We don't know, actually. And I always say, don't get worried about that, because nobody can picture it.
Space is a vacuum, and we know that light reaches us from empty space. The moon is in space, the sun is in space, the stars are out in space, and there's a vacuum between us. So it was hypothesized that no, there's not air out there. There's got to be something, some substance, some medium that light requires for it to propagate. It was called the ether. We ought to be able to measure it. 2 scientists came along. This is in the late 1800s. The physicist Albert Michelson and the chemist Edward Morley. 2 American scientists. And they got together, collaborated, and perfected a new kind of tool called the interferometer. It's a special instrument that allows you to measure with high precision distances and speeds. And so in 1897, they conducted what came to be known as the Michelson-Morley experiment.
Significance of the number 9 holds the spiritual significance of rebirth and reincarnation, and it indicates the end of a phase and tells us a new beginning is ahead. Our solar system, which has been functioning for 4.5 billion years, perfectly revolves around the sun and the 9 planets around it. Multiplying 9 by any whole number except 0 and repeatedly adding the digits of the answer until it's just 1 digit, you'll end up with the number 9. But why is 9 such a significant number?
If imaginary numbers are at the heart of quantum mechanics, then presumably they are an inherent part of the universe. Or are they merely a mathematical construct? In other words, were imaginary numbers discovered or invented?
Oh, well, that's the key question, one of the key questions in the philosophy of mathematics. Mathematicians don't like to admit it, but if you look back at the history of mathematics, a lot of important mathematics was developed because it seemed to be a pattern or a game that nature or God also plays, not just a game that one mathematician invented one Sunday afternoon when he had nothing to do.
Everything that represents
Granted, the fundamental role that numbers play in our lives. In modern times, we've been so busy in manipulating numbers for the sake of counting and calculating that many of us are unaware that they also contain a symbolic meaning. Numbers do not merely have a quantitative nature, but also a qualitative one. Several philosophers, alchemists, and mystics throughout history have associated religious or mystical ideas to numbers. Perhaps the most important of all is the 6th century BC philosopher and mathematician Pythagoras, who saw numbers as the arche, or fundamental underlying substance of reality. He thought that they had divine properties, and as such, that they were tools for communicating with the Supreme Being. Thus, a proper understanding of numbers could lead to an understanding of the basic structural principle of the universe, a notion that influenced the field of sacred geometry, which studies the geometric patterns and forms present in the world, for they are considered sacred and are believed to convey a sense of harmony and order in the universe. Languages such as ancient Greek and Hebrew did not have the Arabic numerical system and used the letters from their alphabets as numbers. The ancient Greeks practiced isopsephy, in which the numerical values of the letters in a word or name are added together and then reduced to a single digit. Those that reduced to the same digit were compared and analyzed for deeper meaning. This goes back to the Pythagorean tradition. The Hebrews did the same thing through a practice called gematria, in which they assigned mystical meaning to words and names based on their numerical values, particularly in Kabbalah. In China, numbers are associated to the sounds they make when said out loud. Some numbers are believed to be auspicious or inauspicious. For example, 4 is related to death and 8 is related to wealth. Similar practices exist across the world, which reflects the human tendency to find symbolic meaning and patterns in numbers and language. Today, this practice is known as numerology, popularized in the early 20th century. Pythagoras is considered the father of numerology because of his interest in the mystical properties of numbers.
Amar. He's 8 years old and lives with his parents and younger sister in a tight family unit. Gibbons are typically monogamous, and his parents have been together for many years. His father, like all males, has black fur and white eyebrows. Females are a paler buff color, like Samar's mother, clinging tightly around her waist. Is Samar's 1-month-old little sister, Raya. She still needs a lot of looking after. As a baby, she's even paler in color. Her fur won't get its true adult coloring for another 5 years. The family takes a well-traveled trail through the forest.
Christianity and anti-Christianity in their final conflict. In his chapter, Modern Pantheistic Philosophy, he's just dealt with the advance of pantheism from Spinoza through Fichte to Schelling. Now he's dealing with Hegel. It is at this point that Hegel, who died in 1831, took up the problem, accepting much from his predecessors. He begins with pure, undetermined being, or what is equivalent with nothing, that is capital N nothing, with zero. And this he calls the idea, capital I, or God. And out of this must all things come. Creation is not an act. Without the world, God would not be God. It is therefore only an eternal process of becoming which he has to explain. He finds the law of this process to be the law of thought, as thoughts alone are real existences and are creative powers. The laws of thought are those of being. Thus the two kingdoms of thought and being, or of spirit and nature, are one. In individual things there is no reality. Man is a passing phenomenon. The only reality is in the first principle, the idea. In other words, in God. In all its determinations, this first principle determines itself. In producing differences, it produces itself in them. The infinite becomes the finite, the absolute, the relative. In all these determinations there is progress, but man only of finite things attains to.
Avoid using these boring
consciousness. In him, the self-determining principle, or God, who is everywhere in nature, comes to know himself, or to self-realization, as distinct from the world. He has no self-consciousness. consciousness. He attains to this in man. Thus man is both one with nature and with the absolute spirit, and therefore the highest of beings, the last in the chain of development. In fine, man is God. Thus we have, according to this philosophy, a spiritual principle or essence called God, which is eternally differentiating himself, or itself, or eternally becoming. All finite or differentiated existences are simply necessary modes of his existence, progressive manifestations of the one infinite essence. The law of this progress Hegel lays down as the identity of contradictions. It is not necessary to our purpose here to speak of this. We are now concerned only with the nature of the relation which he makes to exist between the infinite and the finite, between God and man. And we see here his advance upon Spinoza. With Spinoza, there is no real progress. Man is but one of the transient forms of finite being. With Hegel, he is the end of the series. Only in man does God fully realize himself. It is true, and should be said, that there has been much dispute among the students of this philosophy, whether Hegel meant to absolutely deny the personality of God and the immortality of man or not. But the most competent and impartial interpreters so understand his philosophy. It has been very recently said by Professor Seth in his book Hegelianism and Personality, quote, "If the system leaves us without any self-conscious existence in the universe, beyond that realized in the self-consciousness of individuals, the saying means that God, in any ordinary acceptation of the term, is eliminated from our philosophy altogether. The self-existence of God seems to disappear. Evidently, this is to renounce the idea of anything like a separate personality or self-consciousness in the divine being." As to immortality, Hegel shelves the question. Now, that's all quote from Professor Seth. Back to Andrews. With Hegel, the climax seems to be reached, the last word to be spoken. All dualism is resolved. God alone exists. He is the all, both the infinite and the finite, the absolute and the relative, the eternal and the temporal. His life is an eternal process of self-development. We know the law of his development, and that its ultimate term is man. Humanity is the consummation of divinity. Of the later developments of the Hegelian philosophy in Germany, it is not necessary here to speak. Its three great divisions into right, middle, and left are well known. The first attempts to reconcile this philosophy with the personality of God and the immortality of the soul. The second holds God's personality in a general pantheistic sense, but denies immortality and the Christ of the Church. The last knows no God apart from the world, no immortality, no incarnation, but that in which all men alike partake. In this school are Strauss and Feuerbach, whose position will be examined in another place. Now he moves on to pessimism. The chief representatives of this philosophy are the Germans, Schopenhauer and Hartmann. The fundamental principle, as said by Professor Bowen in his Modern Philosophy, is that, quote, "there is a universal, all-pervading will, a blind and incognitive and unconscious God, coinciding in this respect with the one universal substance of Spinoza." End of quote. Of this will, every individual human existence is but a transient phenomenon, and death is its annihilation. Christianity as a religion, Schopenhauer wholly rejects, as indeed he does all religions except that of the Buddhists, which he denies the existence of a God. He says in his Religion and Other Essays that, quote, "everything true in Christianity is found in Brahmanism and Buddhism." End of quote.
When the world was young and the sands whispered secrets, there emerged a God unlike any other. His name was Ra, the sun god, the bringer of light and life. With his divine gaze, Ra watched over the land, illuminating the darkness and nurturing the earth with his warmth. He was the ruler of the heavens, the master of creation, and the eternal source of power. But even the mightiest of gods faced challenges. Each night, Ra journeyed through the underworld, facing the treacherous serpent Apep, whose darkness threatened to consume the world. Yet, with unwavering resolve, Ra emerged victorious.